very much. This is a quick run through history and a little glimpse of the future, and then Dave's going to bring you back to reality and talk about things how they really are. Okay? I don't know whether you noticed the title, From Science Museum to Joint Strike Fighter. I would like to explain that. Three points to explain. An aeroplane called the Hawker P1127 XP831. It first hovered in October 1960, and it started what was arguably the Harrier family. And there's a picture of the thing doing its trick at Dunsfold. After a very distinguished career, it retired to the Science Museum at South Kensington. It's hanging there from the ceiling. Now, as far as I'm concerned, when you have an experimental prototype that's done a lot of jolly good work, it's the accolade to finish up hanging from the ceiling in a museum as opposed to a hole in the ground. And that's how they got it into the Science Museum. And now the third point I want to make, which should then explain the title, is that in October 2001, just 41 years after XP831 did its first hovers, the Lockheed Martin X-35B won the competition, the Joint Strike Fighter competition, to produce a stealthy supersonic vertical lander. And there is the beast going about its business. Right, now I would just briefly like then to spend about 30-35 minutes on the story of that 41 years of VSTOL flight development, and in particular to dwell on 8 names, which in my view are the names behind the Harrier family. You may have heard of 2 or 3 of them, but I don't think you've heard of more than that. It actually starts 4 years earlier in 1956, as ever, with one guy had a very good idea. And the idea was for vectored thrust. He was, I'm sorry to say, I should. He was a Frenchman. Very well done. And his name was Michel Vibo, and he invented the idea of using rotating nozzles to vector thrust. He took it to Mr. Marcel Dassault, who, as we all know, is Mr. French Aerospace, and he said, no, I don't like that. Now, I mean, it's a bit like us hearing the first demo tape of the Beatles and saying, you won't sell that. I mean, he got it wrong, didn't he? I mean, he got it badly wrong. So that's the second name. If Marcel Dassault hadn't got that decision wrong, then the Harrier would have been a French aeroplane and a broadcast. So what's young Michel Vibo going to do when he's got no support at home? Well, he went to a chap called Johnny Driscoll, who was a United States Air Force colonel, and he was in the Paris office of a NATO bunch called the Mutual Weapons Development Program. Remember, this is just after the Second World War, and the Americans were trying to pull together the sort of research and development that was going on in aeronautical engineering in Europe at that time, and in particular to try and suck out some of the stuff that had been going on in Germany, which was really quite amazing. The final stages of the Second World War. So they set up this Mutual Weapons Development office in Paris. And so he's really a sort of technical administrator, is Johnny Driscoll. Okay, so Michel Vibo said, what do you think about that then? And he said, well, I don't know, but I think I know a bloke who will know. And that chap he wanted to take it to was an Englishman. And so that's how the UK became involved. Now, Johnny Driscoll was just going to leave his job in the way that service people get posted. So he and his successor, Bill Chapman, they went to Stanley Hooker of the Bristol Aero Engine Company, with whom they were working on other projects. And they said to Stanley Hooker, what do you think of this thing? And this being Vibo's brochure. Hooker agreed to look at this thing, which Vibo called a gyroplane. And there it is, folks. We're talking of using the biggest turboprop of the day, an 8,000 horsepower job, taking a shaft out the front, instead of putting a propeller on it, running 4 centrifugal blowers off gearboxes and so on, and then being able to swivel these blowers. I think he called them volutes. So that was his idea for this vector thrust aeroplane. Well, Stanley Hooker obviously had a view on this, and his view was that he's very unhappy with all that mechanical complexity, but he thought the thrust vectoring notion was just ace. Now, like all senior designers, you know, he's got his bright young men, and he's too busy doing paperwork, so he called up one of his lads, Gordon Lewis, and said to him, have a word with Vibo. I like vectored thrust. Can we do a better engine, please? So Lewis and Vibo worked together for a while, and Gordon Lewis's big, very important input was that he felt you could vector the thrust in terms of the output of an existing low pressure or high pressure compressor, rather than have to go through the mechanical stages and then put some more blowers on. So he and Vibo worked together, and they took out a patent for an engine in January 1957. And this was the engine. It ran, and they cobbled it together from existing bits and pieces. The first three stages, the fan, came from an Olympus LP compressor, and there was an Orpheus gas generator up here. So as far as this bit is concerned, we've got an ordinary Orpheus and a single ordinary jet pipe. But we've got some extra turbines to drive the Olympus fan, and there's three stages of it they used. But, and you may have spotted it, the unusual thing is that they had separate intakes for the fan and the HP. So here's the air going to the fan, to the HP, sorry. It's annular, obviously. So they had a separate intake wrapped round the outside of the intake for the fan. Now the air that came into the fan went straight out the front nozzles. Well, went out the nozzles. So that was the BE-53, and they ran that, and it was very successful. Enter Hawker Aircraft. Now at this time, Hawker's legendary fighter designer, Sidney Cam, he also wanted to do VSTOL. I mean, everybody wanted to get away from the vulnerability of long runways, in the military sense. And everybody had tumbled to the idea that all you had to do was attack airfields, and you could stop the aeroplanes that inhabited them from being used. And airfields are fixed, you can't hide them, you know, people were just producing short-range missiles, you only had to put a Latin log in, there was a good chance you could blow up an airfield in general. So he wanted to do VSTOL. And he did not like the multiple lift engine idea that Rolls-Royce were proposing, and as was used a few years later in the short SC1. Now, just a little sideways blip to the short SC1. There it is sitting on a pit at Bedford. Now, what's a pit? Well, it's just a big hole in the ground with a grating over the top. And the idea is that when you've got any sort of lifting system blowing down underneath your aeroplane, to stop it bouncing off the ground and giving you general self-induced turbulence, you can duck the gases away and have them come up somewhere else. So you are, in effect, hovering the thing in free air without the problem of the ground plane and without having to be very high. And you can also do prolonged engine running without heating up the tyres and all that sort of stuff. Well, when I left ETPS at the end of 1963, I was posted to Bedford on the RAE Aerodynamics Research Flight, and they already had this short SC1 there. And the boffins asked me, I mean, I'm a new guy, there's only 4 military pilots at Bedford, squadron leader, a lieutenant commander, and a couple of flight lieutenants, one of them was me. I'm very much a junior guy, still got my L plates on, virtually. And the boffin said to me, go down to Dunsfold and collect XP831 and bring it back up here and compare it to the short SC1. So I thought, it's the best job in the country, you know. I didn't ask them at that stage, why me? Why not the bot, you know. That come later, doesn't matter. I just enjoyed my luck and off I went to get it. And it was an interesting period in history because the engine had a 1-hour life. I'm talking of the engine in 831. It had a 1-hour life with the nozzles down and 25 hours with the nozzles aft. Now you might say, why the difference sort of thing? Well, if you're going to hover, and that's nozzles down, or fly very slowly, nozzles down, you've got to have stabilising bleeds, you've got to have reaction controls for obvious reasons. And if you start bleeding all this air off the back of the compressor, which would normally go on through the engine, have fuel burned in it, spin the turbines round, some of the air will actually be used to cool the turbines. If you rob it of all that air, which it honestly thought it was going to have because it's all come in the front, then you either lose a lot of thrust Or, if you jack the fuel up to keep the thrust there, which is necessary, because you want to hover it, you don't have to put the metal temperatures up at the back end. So you are thrashing the back end of this engine to death. That's effectively what it was. I mean, we're talking of a 10,300 pound thrust engine in an aeroplane that weighed about 10,000 pounds. So it had to be thrashed to get it to hover. And they were dead right in this 1 hour life, because we took it out and it went back to Bristol's and they did a strip overhaul, and every single time there was at least one blade missing in the hot end. Not on the rotating stuff, of course, on the stators. If it had been rotating, we wouldn't have got to the end of the hour because of vibration and so on. So they had it about right. But I'm digressing slightly. The Shaw SC-1 had 4 lifting engines mounted vertically in the fuselage and 1 horizontal propulsion engine. There it is in flight, and it gives you a slightly better idea of the little thing at the back and so on. Right. That came out of Rolls-Royce thanks to their thrust measuring rig, or flying bedstead as some people may have heard of it, or call it, which was a couple of Derwents, and later I think they used Leans, which were strapped back to back on a couple of bent jet pipes, and they hovered this thing so that they could measure the thrust. How did they measure the thrust? By landing it and weighing it. I mean, you land it fairly quickly, shut the engines down, and go and weigh it. I mean, there's no argument. You know the weight of this thing. It's actually perhaps 50 pounds lighter now than it was when it was in the hover, because you used a bit of fuel coming down. But there's nothing like hovering something to measure the thrust. Jet engines, measuring their thrust on the test beds, a very inaccurate process. I mean, you can be sometimes not within even 5 or 6% of the actual thrust. The whole thing's shaking and vibrating, and it's a real mess. It's all heavy engineering, and you can't do delicate sort of thrust measurements. But you get in the hover, different thing entirely. Then you take the thing, whether it be the flying bedstead or later the Harrier, and you put it in the hangar, and you shut the doors, and you wait till everybody's gone away and nobody's moving, and you embed some good old-fashioned scales, balance beam jobs with weights on, you load up the platform. You embed some of those in the hangar floor, and you can weigh your aeroplane, which may weigh 8-9 tons. You can weigh that to 150 pounds quite repeatably. So, thrust measuring rigs, there's a bit of a lesson there. Okay, Sidney Cam's input, because he didn't want to go this route. His input was, because of the complexity of modelable lift engines, I want an alternative idea. So he rang up Stanley Hooker, or he wrote to him actually, and he said, "What have you got any alternatives?" Now, I've spoken to Gordon Lewis personally about that letter, and Gordon insists that if Cam hadn't written that letter to Hooker, then probably the definitive Pegasus would never have been developed. So Hooker replied, obviously with the details of Lewis Vibo engine, sent him off to see Cam, and Cam did the usual trick of saying, "Oh, I see, right," and he brought in his bright young man, last name, Ralph Hooper. And he said, draw an airframe around that engine. And let's remind ourselves what the engine looked like. This thing, this BE-53. Well, Ralph had a lot of trouble with this thing because he'd got a lot of residual thrust out the back of it, of course. No nozzles on the back here. And these, the rotating jobs, had to sort of point forward a bit to give a bit of reverse thrust in order to keep the thing still, if you're going to hover it. And the thing was pretty much of a mess. I mean, he'd got no space under the cockpit floor, there was no room in the thing, he didn't think it would hover anyhow, blah, 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 blah. So he walked away, and a month later he came up with a version that had got side intakes. That's a bit better, we've got a more pristine nose and some volume in the fuselage now, but it's still no good. And then it was Thursday afternoon or something, and he was driving into work, and he suddenly thought, why don't we put 2 nozzles on the rear pipe? Because Ralph had been responsible for doing the bifurcated jet pipe on an airplane called the Seahawk. I mean, magic. I mean, when they put the bifurcated exhaust on the Seahawk, it was to save a pipe going right down through the fuselage and filling up all the space, making it non-available for other kit. So Ralph just thought, why don't we just bifurcate it, then we put some rotating nozzles on that bit. And you say to Ralph, well, how do you have an idea like that? And he said, well, how do you have any idea? It just comes. Or it doesn't. So there we are, that was a quick run through the history, and we at last now had a V-style engine because we put nozzles on the back and rotated those, and we got rid of the double intake thing, and now that it's just like a turbofan on anybody else's airliner. The air comes in the front and is compressed by the LP fan. A percentage of it goes straight out the front nozzles, and a percentage of it goes on through. The bypass ratio is about 1.3 to 1 on this engine, and it just means that whatever units you want to think of in terms of airflow or thrust or what have you on these nozzles, it's 1.3 here and it's 1 there. So there's a tad more coming out the front than the back. That's the P1127, and that was the aeroplane that became XP831, and that was the aeroplane that Ralph was able to draw round that definitive engine. You know how the engine was installed, it was just stuck in like that. We don't have to worry about the gas flows now because we've covered them. How are we going to control this thing? Well, it's got a throttle, big fat thing. Push it forward, the engine goes faster. Pull it back, the engine goes slower. Every engine has one. But this one has also got the nozzle lever, because the thing that moves the nozzles is a mechanical system. It's got a power control. It's called an air motor because it's not an electric motor or hydraulic motor or what. It's operated by compressed air off the engine. And it's got a shaft coming forwards, a shaft going backwards. There's a sort of, think of it as a four-wheel drive vehicle, if you like. I know the wheels are only going to go around through about 98 degrees, but I mean, that's not the point. It's the principle of the thing. The last connection between the output shafts and the actual nozzles is a chain, bicycle chain thing. Well, motorcycle chain, it's fairly thick stuff. You might say, how Heath Robinson? And I would say, no, no, no. Nice and simple, nice and reliable, and it must not break. Because if one of these nozzles starts facing a different direction to the other three, you're not going to be able to control that thing. It's a mechanical failure in adjusting all four nozzle angles to the same angle would be just like having the wing spar come off in the middle of the Atlantic. You know, it won't do. So, it was a very simple mechanical thing. Here's the reaction controls which you've got to have. Pilot knows nothing about these, by the way. You've got a pipe, it comes out off the engine and it goes forward. It's about 4 or 5 inches in diameter, and it goes to the wingtips. It's full of 10 atmospheres stuff, about 135 psi in my money, and it's tapped off the engine, just in front of the combustion chamber. So it's hot by compression, but it's not had fuel burned in it. There are shutters over the end of the pipe, so the air can't come out. Now, you are sitting in the hover, and you are used to, I just say to you, well, just fly at wings level, you know, keep a flat attitude. It's exercise 1, straight level. Keep a flat attitude, you know how to do that. If the right wing goes down, you move the stick over to the left. Down goes the right-hand aileron. But there is a little mechanical link between the right-hand aileron and that puffer. And it opens. And the movement of the aileron that you have done opens that puffer, lets the air blow out underneath, so the wing blows up. Or if you push that aileron up, then it blows out the top. So if you pull a stick back and want to raise the nose, then it opens that up. So the pilot doesn't know anything about this. All he has got is a magic control column which works independent of speed. You know, very, very nice, straightforward thing. Okay, well, as soon as Bill Bedford and Hugh Merriweather tried to hover this thing, noticed the grid, there was a problem. And you can see this thing's all heeled over. Now, if you open the throttle on it like this, then, which way is it leading? This way. This way. The engine has gone round with it, of course, and you will just skitter off sideways to the right as that thrust develops. Now, why is it like that? Well, it's an undercarriage problem. The airplane had got a bicycle undercarriage, and it took 8 years to solve this problem. 8 years. It got a bicycle undercarriage, and on a bicycle, the main wheels are well behind the centre of gravity. Not like a tricycle where they're only just behind the centre of gravity. And it means that you've got to fly a bicycle aeroplane off the ground without significant rotation, like your B-52s and your B-47s and those sort of things, you know. And so you've got to bolt the wing on at some sort of sensible angle of attack, 7, 8 degrees or something, when it's in the ground attitude, so that you can generate wing lift as you run on the ground. Well, why was it bicycle? It was bicycle because they had to keep the rear wheel out of the hot air that was going to come down from the rear nozzles. Let's have a look at a picture of the airplane because that makes it a bit easier to understand. This bicycle kit is designed, any bicycle undercarriage is designed for you to land on the main wheel. It is not designed for you to land on these little kiddie things or even on the nose wheel. So just like a tricycle is designed for you to land on the main wheels and then you put the nose on under some style rather than just go crunch onto the nose wheel, that's the way it is with bicycle. So this thing is designed to take the whole impact of touchdown in the way, just like any other undercarriage leg. Liquid spring, it must be longer, this leg, than all the others, so that it hits the ground first. And when it does compress and take out the energy, of course, there is the rebound bit. And so it sticks itself up and then the thing flops over. So you might say, well, make the outriggers longer. Well, no, because then you may clobber those on the ground when you're landing and the whole thing has to be stressed differently. So we had this problem that the thing heeled on the ground. And it's a problem in conventional landing, it's a problem in short landing, and it's a problem on VTO. Why is it a problem when you've got forward speed? Because heeling a wing that you can't dump the lift on, because it's bolted on at 8 because it's a tricycle undercarriage. You run along the runway, you just go straight off the side if there's any crosswind, and because you heel down. So, how is it sorted? Well, it was sorted by a thing called the self-shortening leg. And this is just magic. I mean, a guy in the design office, he said, oh, I see what your problem is. You don't want any rebound on it. We've got to accept the loads on touchdown, but we don't want any rebound. Okay, this is a liquid spring, this is an ordinary oleo, there's oil squirting through little tiny holes. When it squirts through, we'll take it off the side into an accumulator. So that we've got all this lovely work being accepted by the undercarriage leg on touchdown, but the oil has been squirted off to the side, so there's no rebound. When you next take off, however you take off, the weight of the leg will just drop the oleo down again, and it'll suck the oil back in, and it'll be ready for another launch, another landing zone. Well, you know, imagine, you look all a little bit done. You all right? Yeah? Okay, good. I'm sorry, I go on a bit about this airplane. You're probably not interested. It's a jolly good airplane. Anyhow, with that piece of kit, this thing has got, it just runs absolutely flat on the ground. Whether you're doing a VTO, a VL, short landing, conventional, whatever, and you get none of this heeling, and you get none of the crosswind effects, and it's all magic. Well, I am just going to skate now over the middle period, because that was the start of the Harrier programme, because I just want to say a few words about the future at the end. I'm going to skate over the middle stuff, but let's just look at a few highlights. When the GR1 went into service with the Royal Air Force in April the 1st, 1969, it had some very advanced kit in it, and I'm not talking about the jump jet stuff, I'm talking about equipment. It was the first RAF aeroplane ever with a head-up display. It was the first RAF aeroplane ever with an inertial navigation system. And it was the first RAF aeroplane ever with a moving map display. So it was pretty shiny stuff at that time. About 5 or 6 years later, we started getting all the Harriers back into Dunsfold to fit them with a laser in the nose. Now, before the Gulf War, sometimes you had to explain to people what a laser was used for. We all know its association with smart weapons and improving weapon aiming accuracy, especially on single-pass attacks and so on. So this laser was fitted to the nose, a Frankie piece of kit, LRMTS, Laser Rangefinder and Marked Target Seeker. Very important piece of kit. At this time, and we're talking the mid-70s now, the United States Marine Corps were flying at sea. That's not an aircraft carrier, folks, that's an LPH, a landing platform helicopter. It's a class of ships built for the United States Marine Corps for amphibious assault. So you put all your grunts in the bottom of the ship, you have some helicopters on the top, you drive the ship to perhaps 50 or 60 miles from the beach. You put the chaps in the helicopters and they go yugga-dugga-dug to the beach. Well, during the Second World War, they didn't have helicopters. And they had to climb down rope nets and things on the side of the ship and get into a little landing craft. And now they got the big steamer only about 5 miles off the beach, so it's a bit vulnerable. And they climbed into their landing craft, we all sort of buzzed to the beach. and each one had John Wayne waving in the front, you know, all across the Pacific. Now they lost one hell of a lot of guys on some of those landings because the Japanese were fairly fierce in their resistance, and sometimes the promised fixed-wing air cover from an aircraft carrier somewhere did not arise. It's no good saying why, you know, it's the fog of war or whatever. And a lot of these chaps got slaughtered on the beach. Now if you think about it, this was all going on around 1946. The survivors of some of those amphibious landings were, in 1970, generals running the Marine Corps. And they had wanted for some years their own fixed-wing air cover that they owned, they operated, and they had with their choppers. So if anybody tries to tell you that we sold the airplane to the Americans, we did not. They came over to us and said, we want to buy that, because we think, from the way you're talking about it, it will do this job of flying from this sort of ship, because this is not a big ship, this has not got catapults, this has not got arrestor gear. Okay, now you know that to do a vertical takeoff, you're going to have your weight a tad under your thrust. Otherwise the thing will sit there, it'll hoot and roar, and it isn't going to go anywhere. So what about a short takeoff? Or what do you do if you're a bit too heavy to take off vertically? Well, you do a short takeoff. Let's put some sort of numbers to this. The engine by this stage is 19,500 pounds of thrust. The aeroplane weighs 12,500 pounds of thrust, 12,500 pounds empty. So perhaps you've got a disposal load of a bit less than 7,000 pounds for weapons and fuel. You can put 5,000 pounds of fuel inside the aeroplane, so you can take 2 bombs. But you've got pilots to take 5 bombs. And everybody in the military wants to take as much fuel and as much weapons on every trip. So if you load the thing right up, you're probably about 2 tons too heavy to take off vertically. But remember, that wing's bolted on at an angle, it's got some flaps, and if you just run it along the ground to 70 or 80 knots, it'll generate quite a bit of wing lift. It will certainly produce you a couple of tons. And then you bang the nozzles down when you get to that speed, and bingo, you'll fly with mainly jet lift and a little bit of wing lift. So to do a short takeoff off this steamer, there you are, you position your thing here, you ask that bloke to move his helicopter, and you open the throttle with the nozzles up, and you rush down the deck. When you get to the end, and it's very obvious when you get to the end, just pull the stick back, all right? I mean, the nozzle lever back, and the stick if you want to, but the nozzle lever and it'll fly away on a mixture of jet lift and wing lift. Now, that's fine when the weather's like it looks in that picture. And if it's rough, I mean, we all know what steamers do, you know, they go, you know, they go through the water like that. Well, with your luck and my luck, by about Thursday afternoon, we go off the end of the deck when it's pointing down at the sea. And that's no way to start a trip. And if you're doing it at night, you can't even see it's pointing down. So what do? You either have to say we can't fly in rough water, or you have to limit it to VTOs, or you have to say, well, we've got to be able to pull out, we'll have to take some weight out of the airplane. You know, it's a mess. Well, in about 1975, a bloke called Doug Taylor came up with, he's a lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy, and he came up with the idea of a ski jump, which is just a curved ramp on the front of the steamer, where the exit angle of that ramp is greater than any bow-down tendency of the ship. Super idea. Completely gets rid of all the rough water and ship pitch problems. It had many other advantages as well. It gave you several seconds of guaranteed flight off the end, even if as you went off the end, the engine stopped or the nozzles wouldn't go down. You could run up this with your car. You know, go for it. So, I mean, I'm quite serious. I mean, the chances of ejecting from a flat deck launch that goes wrong right at the end are pretty slim, because you're very close to the water. And none of us take off thinking, oh dear, I hope the nozzle don't fail, I hope that's right. I mean, if you worried like that every time, you wouldn't do the job, would you? So you take off, and it's a big surprise when it goes wrong. Big surprise. Well, you've got several seconds to recover from that surprise and get out the aeroplane if it's doing a ski jump launch. if you want to throw a cricket ball halfway across the cricket ground, you don't throw it horizontally, do you? You throw it up in the bloody air. And it goes a lot further. I mean, the chaps with the howitzers sorted that out, didn't it? Well, it's exactly like that. You can run up this thing with less thrust than you have weight, even with the nozzles down, you know, and with your airspeed. So you can make the aeroplane heavier than you can off a flat net launch, and it will still fly for a while. And during that while, you arrange that the nozzle angle is such that you're picking up 3 or 4 knots of airspeed a second. And after your few seconds of semi-ballistic flight, you're flying at your wing-borne speed. I mean, you could have a 100-yard runway, 27 right or something at Heathrow, providing you had a 10,000-foot cliff at the end of it. And you could run your jumbo at 40 knots off the end of it, couldn't you? And you could let it sink, and providing it took 30 seconds to get to the ground, you know, you'd have picked up the speed to fly away, sort of thing. It might be the odd attitude control problem, but the principle is we need time to do a takeoff run. And that time is reduced dramatically with a ski jump. So it was all excellent news. And there it is, going up this adjustable ramp at Bedford. Okay, the Sea Harrier FRS Mark 1 came along in '78, and it had got a radar, not a laser in the front, and it had got a raised cockpit for air-to-air work and so on. And there we go at Farnborough in 1978 with the ski jump and the first prototype, oh, not the first prototype, the first Sea Harrier that we ever flew, XZ450, and we had the pair of them at Farnborough for the show. Now, everything up to now, and there are over 30 different versions of the Harrier have been in service since 1969. 30 different versions. There are 6 countries flying and 7 air arms. And there are 2 halves to this family. Harrier 1, Roman 1, and Harrier 2, Roman 2. All the things I've been talking about up to now are Harrier 1s. Like, some are single-seater, some are 2-seater, some have got lasers, some have got radars, you know, whatever. But they're all Harrier 1. Now we're going to talk about Harrier 2. The Marine Corps, as soon as they got their Harrier 1s, which they happen to call Aviator Days, doesn't matter, in 1971, they put 2 or 3 guys in a windowless room and said, think about what we need next. And standard military practice. And those guys said, we want another Harrier, but we want one that'll go twice as far with the same load, or carry twice as much load the same distance. So they needed to double the payload radius of action. They wanted to do that from a vertical takeoff as well as a short takeoff. And we said, okay, fine, we need a bigger engine. They said, no, we haven't got any money for a bigger engine. So how are you going to do a heavier VTO? That's a good trick. How are you going to do a heavier short takeoff? Well, that's easy. We need a bigger wing. We need bigger flaps. We need to optimize aerodynamics more and get more wing lift out of this little short run. And so McDonnell Douglas designed a new wing, made it of plastic so it's lighter. That's improved the VTO. Then they took the intakes and they changed those and allowed the engine to breathe better and get more thrust again from the same engine. They did the same thing with the nozzles. And underneath the aeroplane, they put some big strakes. These are called lids in the UK, lift improvement devices. They're just great big strakes, and they contain some of the what's called the fountain effect, the high pressure air that's bouncing up off the ground and hitting the bottom of the aeroplane on VTO as you start a VTO. If you contain some of that, you get an upwards force. It's a bit like a sort of hovercraft bit underneath the fuselage. And we got an extra 1,400 pounds of, I'm talking net now, so you don't have to subtract the weight of the strakes. We got an extra 1,400 pounds of weight off vertically with the same engine, just with those strakes. Oh, excuse me, while we were flight testing this, and I went over to the States in September, October '79 to fly this wing on an old fuselage. The designers were fiddling about with the nose, some lurks, extension in the rear fuselage here to put more kit in, and some minor changes to the tail. These were considered to be low-risk improvements. If these higher-risk things came good, then you would add these changes, the blue changes and the red changes, and you got your Harrier 2. There's a comparison of the 2 wings. Look, the yellow wing is the Harrier 2. Look how much thicker it is. I mean, there's a lot of fuel in there compared to that one. This actually was the aerofoil section off a DC-9. because they said, well, that's a payload radius of action job, an airliner, isn't it? You know, it's supposed to go a long way in a little bag of fuel. Well, the problem with it is that it is an awful lot draggier and it is an awful lot slower, but it did, I mean, something approaching 100 knots slower for the same level of thrust as you would have without it. The little outriggers have been moved in to halfway along. There's a change of area of about 30 square feet, and this one is made of plastic. But huge flaps. Such big flaps now that you have to have the nozzles down to put the flaps down, because otherwise you just blow the nozzles off. Blow the flaps off. So there's an interconnection between the nozzle. When you pull a nozzle down now to do a short takeoff, then the flaps go down, wallop with it. Okay, so let's just quickly. The aeroplanes that we have finished up with, this is the end of the Harrier story now, are Harrier 1s, of which the Sea Harrier FA2 is the most recent version, and that's the first aeroplane with beyond visual range, advanced medium range air-to-air missiles, the US AMRAAM. You can fire this thing, I don't know, at a target 20, 30 miles away. You don't have to see it, it can be at night, the target can be in cloud. The thing that the chaps took down to the Falklands was a Sidewinder, mile or 2 mile range. Got to be able to visually acquire the target before you can release the Sidewinder and so on. Very different kettle of fish. Rod Fredrickson, one of the Dunsfold test pilots, he went over to the States to fire 4 of these at 4 drones over one of their ranges to clear the operation of four of these missiles. All he was faced with was a bunch of targets. The computer decides which one's the biggest threat to the fleet behind him, and it highlights them and it says accept. And if you press the accept button, then off they go and do their job. And I said to Rod, knowing that he'd used the Sidewinder in the Falklands, I said, what do you think of that then? He said, takes all the fun out of it. But, you know, he wasn't being totally serious. And I mean, I won't bang on about how these things work, but I mean, they leave the aeroplane with their own inertial guidance, inertial navigation system. They know your position, they know the target's position. They may have got the target's position from your radar, they may have got it by data link and from an AWACS or something, but they know the target's position and off they go between A and B. Halfway there they turn on their own radar because the target may have manoeuvred, and so they're active homing for the rest of the way, but good piece of kit. The corresponding single Royal Air Force airplane today is the GR7, which is the single seat of these two, and the T10. You see the T10 in formation. It says at the bottom there that the GR7 is operational in the night low-level role using infrared head-up display and night vision goggles. It means that these guys are flying around at 250 feet in the middle of the night on totally synthetic vision aids, and I think that's bloody incredible. It's the job that I had to do in the Royal Air Force to support the Army at short range and so on, close air support, in 1958 using a Hunter. And we said, all right, well, we'll come to work when it starts to get light, and we go home when it starts to get dark, and we'll go home anyhow if the cloud base isn't 800 feet or more, and we'll go home anyhow if we haven't got a mile viz, because all we got is to stop watching a map to find where you want us to go. I mean, things have changed a bit, haven't they? I mean, it's quite amazing. Okay, now, you may have heard of an airplane called the JSF, the Joint Strike Fighter, and the Brits are full partners in this program. And one of the reasons why we're partners is that we have been able to bring to the party some significant technology. And part of that technology is a new fly-by-wire flight control software system, which has been flown in the United Kingdom for many years now in this airplane called the VARC Harrier, Vector Thrust Advanced Aircraft Control or something. It's all in the rear cockpit, and the Boffins at Bedford and now at Boscombe have been developing this software for some time. Anybody in this room who believes what I say, and you have to believe that you can stand up on your hind legs, you have to believe you can do anything, you don't need to do it. Anybody here could jump into the back of that VARC and do a vertical takeoff, accelerate around the circuit, come back to the hover and do a vertical landing. And it goes like this. The chap in the front, the safety pilot, he'll start the engine for you, and you're sitting in the back, and he says, oh, it's all right, it's all working now. To go up, pull the stick back. To go down, push it forward. I mean, flying schools are full of people that teach this. I mean, it's a fairly well accepted thing. So you sit there, you want to go up, pull the stick back. And the computer, because you're not connected to the controls, you're just connected to the computer says, oh dear, he wants to go up. And we haven't got any wing lift. So it puts the nozzles down, it opens the throttle, and up it goes, and you go, ah! And you let go of the pole at 50 feet, and it says, oh, that's good, he doesn't want to go up or down, so it just sits there in the hover. If you're a smart ass, you say, off, like that, you see? And it says, oh, we got one here today. Doesn't he realise we're only 50 feet up, I'm going to creep down from here. If you want to go faster, then you can either, if you're old-fashioned, you can use the throttle that's on the left-hand side here. I prefer to switch on the top of the stick. Hold it forward to go faster, pull it back to go slower. Go left and right. That's all you have to do. So it's not, I hate fly-by-wire. What it is, it's manoeuvre demand. You are demanding the manoeuvre, and the computer decides what has to be moved to make that happen. So that aeroplane was a brilliant piece of kit. I flew it in '93 at Bedford when we were sorting out some new aspects of the software. That was the OC flying at Bedford at the time, a couple of boffins. And the last time I had a go at it was a long time ago, 1999, with the latest iteration of the software, and I can now die happy because it was magic. I mean, all the bugs have been sorted, and it really flew beautifully. Now, that system has just been bought by the Yanks to be put into the JSF. So they are going to control the future vertical landing versions of the JSF using this British software, and I think it's a brilliant achievement. The JSF, as some of you may know, is a stealthy, supersonic single-seater that comes in three versions. Conventional, short takeoff, vertical landing, and carrier vessel or hook or whatever you want to call it, a rested airplane. There were three teams that competed with paper designs: Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and McDonnell Douglas. Only two of those designs were considered good enough and chosen to go forward to build actual prototypes and fly them, and that was Boeing and Lockheed Martin. The teams had to use the same engine, Pratt & Whitney 119. It was good fighter engine of the day. They could modify it, but that's the starting point. Boeing's X-32B, it used a Harrier type pure jet lift. And this is what they've got. There's the engine in the middle, and when they want to hover it, they put a sort of clam door thing shut, bang at the back, and the air gets squirted out as some nozzles just under the centre of gravity. And the reaction controls, of course, but it's pure jet lift. So you are changing, if you like, the sort of cycle of this engine while you're on the downwind, or before takeoff, or on the downwind leg, or whatever. You are, but it's pure jet lift. This stuff in the front, this is fan air, so it's not had fuel burned in it, and it's coming out in a sheet, and the idea was to try and stop the hot air from these nozzles coming forward and going in the intake, which completely ruins everything. And you must try and avoid hot gas recirculation. It wasn't the prettiest aeroplane, at least not in my eyes. There you see the thing with the door shut and the nozzles are about 45 there. There's the engine as they put it in. Okay, now the winner. Lockheed Martin's X-35B. They chose to hold the front of the aeroplane up with a shaft-driven fan, just behind your back, and a big swivelling nozzle to hold up the back end. And that's their power plant. So you take the engine in the middle, which is the common engine, they stick some roll controls on it for ordinary reaction controls. They have a rotating nozzle at the back, and they've got a shaft coming off the front. This shaft has got 26,000 shaft horsepower going through it. 26,000. There's a clutch and a gearbox, and it drives this Rolls-Royce two-stage counter-rotating lift fan. Marvellous piece of kit, and it's installed like that with a fan just behind the cockpit, as I said. They flew it for only 6 weeks, 26th of June 2001 to 6th of August 2001, and that was long enough to put a tick in every box that the competition required. Quite amazing achievement. The thing worked entirely as planned. Not a development program, a demonstration program. It was the only aircraft to perform a short takeoff, level supersonic dash and vertical landing in the same flight. The competition didn't even require that. And to show it was easy, they even put a Marine in it to do it. Anyhow, they did lots of short takeoffs and lots of vertical landings and things, and it was all very routine. They charged about supersonically, and that all worked fine as well. And they flight refueled it. Tom Morgenfeld did 3.7 hours on one trip. And they proved that the ground environment underneath it was not much worse than a Harrier. Now, what's all this about? Well, this is about what's going on under this aeroplane in a low hover. On the right, you see hot white stuff, the infrared stuff. And I've drawn the arrow on there because you can't see the cold air coming out the fan. Let's make it a bit bigger. Can you see how this hot air is, when it hits the ground, it splashes radially in all directions. Some of it will go forwards. And if you don't stop it, it will just go forwards, and it's hot, so it goes up and it goes in the intake, and that's no good. So this is what the fan is there for, and it has, can you see how it's, the air that splashed backwards off the fan has just turned the hot air around. Brilliant, isn't it? Ever so simple, well, not simple, but I mean ever such a reliable and good way of doing it. They did all this 2,500 feet up above sea level at Edwards and up to 94 degrees there. The poor old Boeing people, they went over to the east coast and sea level, and they had to take lumps off the aeroplane because it turned out to be too heavy to fly, to hover. I've got, it's about a sort of 2 or 3 minute video of the first hovers. Would you like to see that? How are we doing on time, mate?
Yeah,
I've got about 2 minutes.
let's carry on.
All right, okay. Now, Lockheed Martin, very big company. I mean, you know, everything from the Starfighter, the U-2, every magic aeroplane you could think of, they've done. But they've never done one that hovered. And so they got a Brit to do the first flights. That's the sign of a good bunch, in my view. You know, they're quite prepared to believe that it'd be better to have some help. And it was Simon Hargreaves, who is one of the former Dunsfold test pilots. He's now at Wharton. He was a Royal Navy operational pilot before he went to TPS, and he was the lead pilot on this vertical landing aeroplane. Justin Paynes, the chap that was sitting in the front of the Vark aeroplane when I flew it last, he was the second pilot to fly this aeroplane over in the States. So the Brits are well represented. This thing's taxiing onto a grid. There's, it looks like Art Tomasetti, a Marine, looking important, standing there, and there's the nozzle going down at the back. See, nasty looking piece of kit, but it's, and there's a very nice, there's Art again, very nice Union Jack on the side of Simon's shoulder. And that's the first lift. He's got the nose wheel off. If you have a look at the main wheels, they're just skippering forward slightly. He's getting the attitude right, and up she goes. Magic, eh? Remember, this is a stealthy aeroplane, so all this lot, when it's not flying in the circuit, there's got to be shut up, and all these doors and things have got to work, and it makes it look a bit messy when it's in the hover, but it's the only way to keep the thing stealthy when it's going about its normal business. Well, seemed to please the locals. That's the program manager, actually. I thought that was, yeah, jolly good, actually. I mean, very well done, young Simon. Something of a tradition in the United States. And there we go, on the second lift, a bit more positive this time, because you've done it all before. And it was an extremely successful flight test program. I mean, to rush through the stuff that they did in only 6 weeks. I mean, the progress that was originally made in 1960 in 6 weeks was negligible. Absolutely negligible. So this modern kit, it looks complicated, but then engineers are better at their thing. Software guys are better at their thing. We've got reliability fairly well nailed these days, and things do tend to be much better designed, and they actually work as predicted. Okay. Right. It's planned to be in service 2008, but until that golden day, and that's going to slip, isn't it? Until that golden day, I want you to remember that the best V-stop bomber in the world is the Harrier GR7. The best V-stop fighter in the world is the Harrier FA2, Sea Harrier FA2. But, and there's a very big but, it's all thanks to 4 British designers. Stanley Hooker and his man Gordon Lewis, Sidney Cam and his man Ralph Hooper.
If you could do it all again, would you do anything different?
No, I don't think so. That's an interesting question. Never had that one before. No, I've been very lucky. I was just in the right place at the right time. And I might have talked to some of the commercial people in the company slightly more differently. I might have actually resigned a couple of times instead of just threatening to. Things like that. But no, not essentially, no.
Which aircraft do you get most pleasure out of flying then over the years? You've obviously flown very many.
The Harrier is so many different airplanes rolled into one that if you've been lucky enough to have a crack on that, it's obviously going to be a favourite airplane, at least from the point of view of understanding airplanes and learning your trade and so on. But outside the Harrier, my firm favourite was the Vulcan, no question at all. Possibly because I was basically a small airplane man, and to be given a great big thing. I did 115 hours of takeoff and landings one day. Well, not one day, one...
They were long days then.
Yeah, I had...
doing time machine.
I did 115 hours.
This is a black and white still.
Just takeoffs and landings, because it was 1965 or something, and it was Concorde research work on a takeoff director for Concorde, and that was for me a fascinating experience. It's the Vulcan's the only airplane I've ever been in where I've never felt short of wing. Because some airplanes, a lot of military airplanes, just won't go around corners. I mean, you feel, the thing is very much like a lead sled, and it does not want to turn at some low speed or whatever. But the Vulcan was just magnificent. And once we had got this takeoff director thing working, which is just a set of cross pointers, you sit on the beginning of the runway, you've got the brakes on, and a thing that looks like an ILS sitting there in the middle of the flight director, and the horizontal bar, the pitch bar, is right down the bottom. You let the brakes off, and this bar kicks up because there's a box in the backs of the airplane can see you accelerating. That's just to give you the confidence, and then it goes and sits down the bottom again. And then when you get to 5 or 10 knots before VR, it starts walking up the screen, and you just have to capture it, and off you go. Now, if you chop an engine at this point, then the bar responds to the reduced thrust and lowers the nose for you, so you can just go off and fly it how you like. You just keep the pointers crossed. You don't have to know speed, you don't have to know weight, you don't have to know temperature, you don't have to know anything about the Vulcan. And when I got to the point of putting airline pilots through that, because it was a couple of RAF flight lieutenants who'd come up with the control laws for this thing, and we said, well, we'd better put some airline pilots through it now. And I got the job of checking these guys out. I was absolutely insistent I wasn't going to tell them a thing about the Vulcan, not a thing, because they're just here to assess this thing. Now, the bloke called Evans, who was my commanding officer there, he could see that if we had an accident with the Vulcan, it's a two-crew airplane normally, you've got a bloke in the right-hand seat who's not been briefed on the airplane, that didn't seem right to him. But it seemed to me, a chap used to flying a Trident, because that was the sort of airplane of the day, in his shirt sleeves, nice big cockpit, and you're putting him up this ladder in this hole, and he's got this bang seat on it, and the Vulcan's got a little slot here, and a sort of porthole there. His mind was not going to be on the job unless you kept away from Vulcan as much as you could. I was not going to brief on it. So we just said, go down the runway and follow it as I described. The good guys would just go straight off, and so you take it at 1,800 feet, land it, do another takeoff. Second one's fine. Right, now I'll throttle an engine back on you on the next launch. So just after they got airborne, you throttle an engine back and the bar dips and off they go. With the best guys, I was throttling one back just before VR, another one just after VR, and the third one just as it unstuck. And they were going off the end of 2.7 Bedford, where the ground drops away, 200 feet a minute, in a strange aeroplane on their sixth takeoff, without knowing a single speed or attitude or anything. But there was only one guy, this is really the point of the story, there was one guy who really got up my nose. He was a chap from CAFU. Anybody have anything to do with CAFU? Civil Aviation Flying Unit, for those who... a bunch of CAA-type narcs, and we'd invited him up, you know, and it was his day off sort of thing, but he couldn't get rid of this examiner sort of approach, and he was I thought he was extremely rude. It was my aeroplane, you know. I know I've only got a couple of narrow RAF stripes, and he's got 4 of these gold things, but he obviously thought that only he could fly an aeroplane. You know? And when we came into land for the last time, he'd spoilt my day. I thought I'd just show him that other people can fly an aeroplane. And we've been landing on the main drag 27, and there's a little narrow cross runway 24. And so I just turned finals on that. Now the Vulcan never showed a wing lift. It had 125 knot minimum speed. Not determined by lift or stall or anything like that, but because you could have a bit of lateral control trouble in turbulence. There wasn't a turb in the sky. And I came over the security fence, which is just by the threshold of 24, at about 100 feet, and it was 125 knots, it was just trickling off. And I popped the parachute, and I opened the bomb doors, and I popped, the air brakes were already out, and I stopped, got the 2 outboard engines, and I just pulled them over. And this thing went slower and slower, and it went up. and I put the brakes on and stopped, and we hadn't got to the main runway, and that's about 900 feet, you know. And I said, you see, it's got a lot of lift, this aeroplane. And he didn't respond, he was just staring at the front of the cockpit, and I think he thought he was dead. And he was waiting for the gates to... I'm sorry.